Hello everyone, my name's Stunsy Boy and welcome back to Metamorphosis. No silly intro today because this is gonna be a long video. Actually, it's shorter than yesterday's technically. But whatever, we're back with Metamorphosis, a weird book. But yeah. So without further frickin' ado, let's read. Chapter 2. Only as dusk was falling did Gregor wake from his heavy, faint-like sleep. He probably wouldn't have slept much longer even with the disturbance, or he felt sufficiently rested and restored, but it seemed to him that he had woken a fleeting step and a careful shutting of the door of the vestibule. The plaid gleam in the electric sleep lamps touched the ceiling here and there in the upper edges of the furniture, but down where Gregor lay was all dark, slowly groping artfully in his feelers, which he was only now learning to appreciate. He dragged himself toward the door, wanting to see what happened. His left side felt like one long, unpleasantly contracted scar, and he was forced to limp outright with his 2 rows of legs. One of his diminutive legs, indecently, had suffered grievous injuries in the course of morning events. It was almost miraculously only one had been injured, and now trailed lifelessly behind him. Not until he reached the door did he realize that, in fact, that had lured him there. It was the smell of something edible. There stood a bowl filled with sweet milk. It was little pieces of white bread were floating. He almost sighed with delight, for his hunger was now even more powerful than in the morning, and right away he dunked his head in the milk almost up to his eyes, but he quickly drew it out again in disappointment. It wasn't that eating was difficult thanks to the tender left side. He couldn't eat it all without his entire body becoming gradually involved. But beyond that, even though the milk had always been his favorite drink, but there's no doubt why his sister had brought him some now, it didn't taste good to him at all. Indeed, it was almost within revolution that he turned away from his bowl and crept back to the center of the room. In the living room, as Gregor saw through the crack, the glass has been lit. But while usually at the door hour, his father liked to read aloud the afternoon paper to Gregor's mother, and sometimes his sister as well, in a dramatic voice. Now there is not a sound to be heard. Well, perhaps it is customary, reading aloud that his sister had often told and written him about had recently fallen out of practice. But even in the other rooms, everything was so still. Even though the apartment was surely not empty, it was quiet life by family had been leading, Gregor had said to himself, as he gazed fixedly into the darkness before him. He felt great pride having been able to give his parents and sister a life in such a beautiful apartment. But what if his all tranquility, all of this prosperity and contentment were now coming to a horrific end, so as not to get lost in the complications? Gregor set himself in motion, crawling back and forth across the room. Once in his course the long evening of one of the side doors opened a tiny crack, and then quickly shut again, and once another one. Someone must have felt an urge to enter, and overcome by misgivings, Gregor now stationed himself just in front of the living room door, determined to somehow coax the hesitant visitor inside, or at least find out who it was. But the door did not open again, and Gregor waited in vain. Before all the doors were locked. Everyone kept trying to come in, and now he had opened the one door, and the others had apparently opened during the day. No one came. The keys were sticking in their locks from the outside. It was late at night by the time the light of the living room went out, and now it was easy to discern that Gregor's parents and sister had remained awake all this time, for all 3 of them would clearly be heard departing on tiptoe. Now it was unlikely anyone would come to Gregor's room before morning, so he had plenty of time to ponder the rest to reorder his life. But his high open room, in which he was forced to lie flat on the floor, distressed him, without being able to determine the cause. After all, it was his room, which he had liked living in for 5 years now. And with a half-conscious motion, and not without a twinge of shame, he scurried beneath the settee, where even though his back was a bit cramped, he could no longer raise his head. He once felt right at home, his only regret being his body was too wide across to accommodate entirely beneath the piece of furniture. Here he remained the entire night, which he spent turning to dozing, though he was awoken again and again by his hunger, and mulling over his worries and indistinct hopes, which however all led to the conclusion that, for a time being, he should have behaved calmly by employing patience and the utmost consideration, assist his family in enduring the inconveniences of the current state, inevitably forced him to impose on them. Early in the next morning already, so early it was almost still night, Gregor had the opportunity to test the strength of all the resolutions that he had made. For some of the vestibule, his sister, almost completely clothed, opened his door to cast an anxious glance into the room. He didn't immediately spot him, but when he noticed him beneath the settee, well, goodness, he had to be somewhere. It's not that he might have flown away. Yet the sight so alarmed her that, unable to control herself, she slammed the door from the outside. But it was regretting this conduct, she opened it again, and once came in, walking on tiptoe as though he was entering his room a gravely ill patient or even a stranger. Gregor, having slid his head just beneath the edge of the setting tea, observed her. Would she had left the milk standing, or not because of lack of hunger, and she would bring him another food, more likely. If she failed to do so on accord, he would sooner starve than call this her attention, though in fact he felt as nearly monstrous urge to scoot out from underneath the settee, throw himself at his sister's feet, and beg her for something good to eat. But his sister immediately remarked to his surprise that the bowl was still full, and there's just a little milk spilled on the floor around it, and she picked it up right away, not with her bare hands to be sure, but with a rag, and carried it out of the room. Gregor was unexpectedly curious to see what he'd bring, and instead he mulled over the various possibilities, but never would have been able to predict what his sister in her kindness proceeded to do. To gauge his taste, she brought him an entire assortment of foodstuffs, all spread out on an old newspaper. There were old, half-rotten vegetable bones from a family supper the night before, caked in a concealed white sauce, a few raisins and almonds, a piece of cheese Gregor had declared inedible 2 days before, a dry piece of bread, a slice of buttered bread, and a slice of bread with butter and salt. In addition, she placed beside a feasted bowl that apparently had been reserved for Gregor once and for all. It was now filled with water, and out of delicacy, since she knew Gregor could not eat in front of her, she quickly withdrew and turned the key in the lock so Gregor could understand he could make himself at home. Gregor's little legs whirred in how he went to take his meal. His wounds indecently seemed to have healed entirely in the meantime, for he no longer felt the least impairment. This is astonishing. For more than a month he could cut his finger just a tiny bit with a knife, and all wound had been painful enough just the day before yesterday. I best be fastidious than before, he thought, already sucking greedily at the cheese, to which he found himself immediately and actually drawn more than any other items. Quickly, his eyes shedding tears of gratification, he devoured in swift succession. The cheese, the vegetables, the sauce, the fresh fruit, by contrast, did not taste good to him. In fact, he could not even stand the smell of it, so he dragged the things he wished to eat a little to one side. He had long since finished everything. It was lying indolently where he was when his sister slowly turned the key in the lock as a signal for him to withdraw. At once she gave the start, though he'd been in point of nodding off, and he hurried back under the settee. But it cost him a great deal of willpower to remain there the short period of time his sister spanned the room for the hearty meal. He enjoyed what caused the abdomen to swell, and he could scarcely breathe in confinement. In between little attacks of suffocation, he peered out in slightly bulging eyes at his sister. Oblivious, used a broom to sweep up not only the remains of the meal, but also the food he hadn't even touched, as if the items were no longer fit for consumption. Then she hastily dumped everything in a bucket, and she covered with a wooden lid before carrying all to the room again. She had scarcely turned back with Gregor, hauled himself out of the settee, stretching and puffing up his body. This is how Gregor now received his food each day. Once in the morning, when his parents and the maid were still asleep, and the second time after everyone had eaten lunch, for his parents would always nap a little afterward, and his sister would send the maid out for an errand or another. Surely they didn't want Gregor to starve either, but perhaps it had been through too much for him to experience his meal through a more hearsay, or perhaps his sister wanted to spare him even the modest sorrow, for Lord knows they were suffering enough. Gregor never learned when the pretext his doctor and locksmith had been sent away for the first morning, ever since for himself could not be understood. It occurred to no one, not even his sister, that he could understand the others. So when his sister came to his room, he had to be content merely by hearing the sighs she heaved now and then, and her words of supplication addressed the saints. Only later, when she had started to grow accustomed to all this, though, of course, it was impossible to become fully accustomed to circumstances like these, would Gregor sometimes catch a remark that was meant to be friendly where it could be interpreted as such. "He tucked right in today," she would say when Gregor found the food she left him particularly tasty. While in the opposite case, when gradually began to occur more and more often, she had a habit of saying almost mournfully, "This time he didn't touch a thing." And while no news reached Gregor directly, he sometimes was able to overhear this and that from the rooms on the other side of this. Whether he heard voices, he immediately run over to the door and questioned and pressed his entire body against it. Especially in the early days, there was rarely a conversation that did not somehow, if only directly, refer to him. For 2 days, every mealtime is spent deliberating how the family will only comport itself. But even between meals, his same discussion continued, for at least 2 members of the household were present at all times, since apparently no one wanted to remain at home, and of course, leaving the apartment unattended was out of the question. That much more, the maid had fallen to her knees before Gregor's mother the very first day. It was not entirely clear how much she knew of what had occurred, begging to be released from family service. But when she took leave in the quarter of an hour later, she tearfully thanked him for dismissing her, as though it was the greatest benefaction she had experienced in her hands, and without anyone asking this of her, she swore to solemn oath to never reveal anything at all to anyone. Now Gregor's sister was forced to do cooking in the concert with his mother. To be sure, not much effort was involved, as no one did much eating. Again and again, Gregor would hear one of them pressing the others to eat, always in vain, and never with any other response than "Thank you, I've had all I want," or similar. Perhaps they would drink anything either. Often Gregor's sister would ask her father if he wouldn't like a beer, affectionately offering a fetch herself, and when he did not respond, she would say, wishing to relieve him of scruples, that she would send a porter's wife for it as well. And when the fathers would hear utter great no, and no one spoke of it any longer. Already in the course of the first day, Gregor's father explained his family finances and prospects not only to Gregor's mother, but to his sister as well. Now when he would let up at the table and, from his small weathered safe, which he had salvaged from his business collapsed 5 years ago, extracted a receipt from Memorandum book, he could hear him opening the complicated book lock and bolting it shut again after removing the desired item. The explanations on his father's part included the first bits of heart-giving news Gregor had heard since the captivity began. He had been under the impression that his father had retained nothing at all from his former firm holdings. At least his father had never said anything to the contrary, and admittedly Gregor himself had never asked him about this. At the time, his only concern had been to do everything in his power to let his family forget as quickly as possible. The mercantile catastrophe had plunged all of them into a state of utter hopelessness. Then, too, he had to get work to the particular zeal and risen almost overnight from petty clerk to salesman, in which capacity, of course, he had quite different earning potential, and his professional accomplishments in the form of commissions were immediately transformed into cash that could be plunked down on a table at home. Before his eyes of his astonished, delighted family, those are lovely times, and never since they've been repeated, at least not of such glory. Although Gregor later earned so much money that he was in position to cover the expenses for the entire family, which then he did. All had grown accustomed to the arrangement of not the family, but Gregor as well. The grateful accepted the money, and he was happy to divide it. But the exchange no longer felt particularly warm. Only Gregor's sister had remained close to him all this time. It was a secret plan to send her off to study the conservatory next year. Unlike Gregor, he dearly loved music, and could play the violin movingly. Despite the considerable cost it would no doubt entail, money that could surely be brought by other means. Often during the brief periods of time Gregor spent in town, the conservatory would come up with this conversation with his sister. Not only ever as a lovely dream of those realization was unthinkable, and her parents did not like to hear mention even in the obvious way, but Gregor was thinking the matter over and great determination intended to make a formal announcement on Christmas Eve. Thoughts like these, utterly futile in the current state, passed through his head as he stood against the door, eavesdropping. Sometimes general exhaustion made it impossible for him to go on listening. He could carelessly let his head bump against the door, but then he could immediately hold his head still again. Breathing the faint silence produced had been heard in the next room, causing everyone to fall silent. I wonder what he's getting up to now, his father would always say after a while, apparently facing the door, and only when he would interrupt the conversation would resume. Gregor now learned, and learned quite well. His father tended to repeat himself with explanations, in part because it has been so long since he had last concerned himself with such matters, in part because Gregor's mother did not always understand everything the first time. That, despite of all their misfortunes, a small nest egg, not only a tiny one, still remained to them from before, and had grown a little, thanks to the untouched interest that accumulated meanwhile. In addition, the money Gregor had brought home each month, he only ever kept a few gulden for himself, and not yet even entirely used up, and had grown into a small capital. Behind his door, Gregor nodded eagerly, delighted in his unexpected prudence and thrift. To be sure, he might use the surplus to pay off more of his father's debts than his boss, and the day in which he would be able to invest himself and the post would no longer be nearly so far off. But as he stood, his father's arrangements were no doubt for the best. Now his money was by no means sufficient to allow the family to live off the interest of anything of that sort. It might possibly have been enough to sustain a family for a year, 2 at most, but there was all there was. So in fact, there was some kind of sum only one really shouldn't touch. One of the set aside in the case of emergency. The money to live on would have to be earned. Gregor's father would be admittedly in good health, but he was old and hadn't worked in a full 5 years. And in any case, he was supposed to avoid overtaxing himself. In those 5 years, the first holiday in the strenuous yet unsuccessful life had put a lot of weight and now lumbered as he walked. And that was Gregor's old mother now supposed to hold down a job, despite her asthma, and the fact that it was already an exertion for her to cross from one end of the apartment to the other, for which reason she spent every second day grasping for breath at the sofa beside the open window, and was his sister go out working, the child of 17 whose lifestyle no one would begrudge her, dressing nicely at a sleeping state. This child of 17 whose lifestyle no one would begrudge her, dressing nicely, sleeping late, helping out around the house, taking part in a few modest entertainments, and above all playing the violin. Whenever the family came to speak of the necessity of someone earning money, Gregor would go to the door and throw himself down upon the cool leather sofa beside it. burning with shame and sorrow. Often he would lie there an entire long night, not sleeping for a moment, just scrabbling for hours against the leather, or, not shunning the great effort it cost him, to push an armchair over to the window. He would climb up the sill and, propped on the armchair, lean against the window, apparently lost some sort of reverie of now liberating he always found it to gaze outside. For the truth, he saw even the objects were quite near and hand less and less clearly as the days progressed. The hospital across the way, whose all constant sight he had earlier revealed, was now no longer even visible to him, and he had not known perfectly well as he was a resident of Charlottenstrasse, a quiet but perfectly urban street. He might have imagined it was gazing out of the window onto the desert in which the grey sky and the grey earth had indistinguishably conjoined. His attentive sister, who only had to see the armchair standing beside the window twice before starting to push it back to its place each time she tied it in his room. Indeed, she began leaving the window's inner sash open. If only Gregor would been able to speak to his sister and thank her for all she could do for him, he would have found her misfortunes easier to bear. As if it suffered beneath him, his sister, to be sure, did all she could to obscure the awkwardness of the situation, and the more time passed, the better she succeeded. Of course, even the way she made her entrance jangled his nerves. The moment she came in, without even pressing shut the door, although she always took the pains to shield the others from the sight of Gregor's room, she would race straight away to the window, fling it open with hasty hands as though it was part of suffocating, when it remained there, however cold it might be, gulping in the air. All this racing and racket was inflicted on Gregor thrice a day. He would be trembling beneath the salary, painfully aware that she would no doubt have willingly spared him the disruption if it were possible for her to endure being in the same room as Gregor with the window closed. Once, it must have been a month since Gregor's metamorphosis, so there was no particular call his sister had been startled by his appearance. She came into his room a little earlier than usual to discover him, motionless and propped upright for his horrific effect, gazing out of the window. Gregor would have not found it surprising if he had not chosen not to enter, since his position prevented her from opening the window right away, but she didn't just not enter, she started in an alarm and shut the door. A stranger might have thought Gregor had been lying in wait, meaning to bite her. Gregor naturally went and hid himself away beneath the settee, but he would wait until the noon before his sister returned, and she seemed far more agitated than usual. From this she understood the appearance was still unbearable to her, and would remain so, and that she no doubt had to struggle to force himself not to run away in the sight of even a small part of his body that protruded from beneath the settee. In order to spare her even the sight, one day he carried the bedsheet over the settee on his back. This labor cost him 4 hours, and arranged it in such a way that it was now completely covered, so his sister would not be able to see him even if she bent down. If she considered the sheet unnecessary, it caused removed it, since it was clear enough that it would be possible to be considered a pleasure for Gregor to shut himself off to completely. But he left the sheet where it was, and Gregor even thought he glimpsed a grateful look when, one point, she carefully lifted the sheet just a little with his head to see how sister liked the new arrangement. During this first fortnight, Gregor's parents could not bring themselves to enter his room, and after he heard expressing their heartfelt appreciation of his sister's labors, whereas earlier they had often been annoyed with her, since she had seemed a rather useless girl. But now both of them, father and mother alike, would often just be waiting outside Gregor's door, while his sister would tidy up his room, and as soon as she emerged, would give him full report on what things looked like in the room, what Gregor had eaten, how he had behaved this time, and whether perhaps any modest improvement would be seen. His mother indecently had wanted to visit him relatively soon, but his father and sister held her back, appealing at first at a sense of reason as Gregor listened to attentively, wholeheartedly approving. Later, though, she had to be held back by force, and when she cried out, "Let me go to Gregor, he's my unhappy son. Can't you understand I must go to him?" When Gregor thought it would perhaps be good for his mother to visit him, not every day of course, perhaps once a week after all, she had far better grasp of things than his sister, who despite the courage was still a child, and when it came right down to it, and perhaps only on the difficult task of the child's frivolity, Gregor's wish to see his mother is soon fulfilled. During the day, Gregor avoided showing himself at the window, if only out of consideration for her parents, but there wasn't much crawling he could do in a few square meters of space that the floor provided. Lying still already difficult for him to endure without during the night. Eating soon ceased to give him even the slightest pleasure. So to divert himself, he took up the habit of crawling back and forth across the walls and ceiling. He particularly liked hanging from the ceiling, high above the room. It is completely different from lying on the floor. No one could breathe more freely there. The gentle swaying motion rocked the body, and in almost happy absent-mindedness, Gregor experienced it might happen. In his own astonishment, he would let go in a crash to the floor. But now, of course, he had his body far better under control than before, and he's even as great as fall as it did him no harm. His sister immediately noticed the new entertainment Gregor had devised for himself. The purgations left behind sticky trails here and there, and he got it under the head to make it possible for Gregor to range as widely as possible by removing the furniture and impeding his movement. Above all, the wardrobe and desk. But she wasn't able to do so on her own. She didn't dare to ask her father for help. The maid most certainly would not have helped her, for the girl was 16 or so. Though she had courageously remained in the household after the departure of the former cook, had at the same time requested the privilege of keeping the kitchen locked at all times, and only opening the door upon particular requests. And so the sister had no choice but to summon her mother. One day when her father was out, the mother arrived with explanations of feverish joy, but fell silent at the door of Gregor's room. At first, of course, Gregor's sister checked to confirm that all in the room was as it should be. Only when then did she allow her mother to enter. In the utmost haste, Gregor had tugged the sheet down lower and lower in the looser folds, so that it really did look as the bedsheet happened to have been tossed over the settee. She also refrained from peering out of beneath the sheet at this time. For the moment he would resign himself not to be seeing his mother and be glad she'd come. "It's all right, come in, you won't see him," Gregor's sister said, apparently leading her mother by the hand. Gregor now heard the sounds of two weak women grappling with this, in fact, quite heavy old wardrobe, with his sister laying claim in the bulk of the work, not listening to abominations of her mother, who was afraid she would overtax herself. It took a very long time, but perhaps a quarter of an hour's labor. Gregor's mother said they should leave the wardrobe where it was after all. In the first place, it was too heavy. They would not finish before Gregor's father came home. By leaving the wardrobe in the middle of the room, they would prevent Gregor from moving around at all. And secondly, it wasn't even clear what we were doing him a favor by taking away the furniture. To her, it seemed to be opposite was true. The sight of the empty wall positively oppressed her heart. And why should Gregor not experience the same sentiment? Since after all, long accustomed to having his future around him, wouldn't he feel abandoned in the emptied-out room? And if not, as if this mother concluded in a low voice. In fact, she had been whispering all along, as though she wished to avoid letting Gregor, whose exact whereabouts she did not know, hear so much as a sound in her voice, for she was convinced that he could not understand her words. And it was not as if by removing the furniture he was showing that giving all hope of a cure, and ruthlessly abandoning him to his own devices. I think it should be best that we try to keep the room in precisely the same state as it was in before, so that when Gregor returns to us, he will find everything unchanged. Which will make it that much easier for him to figure out all that's happened in the meantime. Hearing his mother's word, Gregor realized that he, sense of all direct human justice, combined with the monetary life of family myths, must have been muddled in understanding over the course of these 2 months. For he did not otherwise explain to himself how he could seriously have wished to have his room emptied out. But he really didn't want to have his warm room, comfortably furnished with family heirlooms, transformed into a cave or den, in which, to be sure, he could be able to crawl out unhindered in every direction, but the present simultaneously swiftly and completely forgetting his human past. He was already on the verge of forgetting, and only his mother's voice, which he had gone along now without hearing, had shaken him awake. Nothing should be removed. Everything must remain. He was unwilling to forego the good influence of furniture and the bad had in his condition, and as if furniture got in the way of practically his mindlessly crawling about, this was by no means his deterrent. In fact, it was a great advantage. Unfortunately, his sister was in a different opinion. She had developed a habit, not entirely without the cause to be sure, of presenting herself as the holder of particular expertise in discussing Gregor with her parents, and so now her mother's counsel was reason enough for her to insist the removal not only of the wardrobe and desk, as she originally had been intending, but for every last bit of room's furnishings, with the exception of the indispensable settee. Naturally, with only childish defiance and hard-won self-assurance she had so unexpectedly acquired in the recent weeks that had dictated this demand, she had, in fact, observed that Gregor needed a great deal of space to crawl around, while as far as anyone could see, he made no use to answer the furniture. Perhaps the fanciful imagination of a girl her age played the role as well, a sensibility always seeking out gratification, and one which Gregor had allowed to persuade her to render Gregor's situation even more horrific than before, so as to be able to do even more for him than he had hitherto. For a room in which Gregor held sole dominion over empty walls is a place where no one other than Gregor would ever dare set foot. And so he had held fast to her resolve, despite the protests of her mother, who appeared troubled to the point of indecision. Even by the room in the present state, she wanted to fell silent, and helped Gregor's sister remove the wardrobe the best she could. Well, the wardrobe was something Gregor could do without if he need be. but the desk would certainly have to stay. And no sooner had the women left the room, the cabinet groaning as they pressed against its weight, and Gregor poked out his head from beneath the settee to see how he might cautiously and considerately as possible intervene. But unfortunately, his mother was the first to return while Greta was still in the next room, clasping the wardrobe in her arms and tipping it back and forth on her own, without, of course, moving it from the spot. But Gregor's mother was unaccustomed to his appearance. It might have been made her ill to catch a glimpse of him, and so Gregor, in alarm, withdrew as fast as he could to the far end of the settee. But it was too late to prevent this front edge of the bedsheet from stirring a little. His was enough to attract his mother's notice. Startled, she froze for a moment, and then went back to where Gretty was. Although Gregor kept telling himself that nothing extraordinary was happening, just a few sticks of furniture being shifted about, he was soon forced to admit that all coming and going on the part of the women were little exclamations of furniture scraping against the floor, the combined effect of the tumultuous hubbub intensifying all around him. And no matter how tightly he drew his head and legs and impressed his body against the floor, he soon was forced to consider that he would not be able to endure this much longer. They were clearing out his room, taking him from all that was dear to him. He had only already borne away the cabinet in which he lay his fret saw and other tools, and now they were prying loose desk that dug itself firmly into the floorboards. His desk, at which he had written his homework assignments as a student at a commercial academy, as a secondary, even a primary school pupil. Truly, there was no time left to explore the good intentions of these two women, whose existence, by the way, he had almost forgotten. For their exhaustion was now making labor in silence, and one heard their heavy footsteps. And when he burst out of hiding, the women in the next room were leaning on the desk, catch their breath, changing direction 4 times as he raced about, and he really didn't know what to say first. But now his eyes lit on the picture of a lady clad in all furs, conspicuous now on the otherwise empty wall, and quickly he made his way up to it and pressed himself against the glass, which had heard to him pleasantly cool against his hot belly. And at least his picture, which Gregor's body now covered up completely, was absolutely certain not to be taken away from him. He was leveled his head toward the living room door and observed the women as they returned. They didn't permit themselves much rest at all, and they were only on their way back. Reddy had slung one arm about her mother, nearly carrying her. So what do we take next? Gretty said, looking around. When her eyes met those of Gregor, who he clung to the wall. It was no doubt only because of her mother's presence she kept her composure, bowing her face toward her mother to prevent from glancing about. She said, hastily trembling to be sure, "Let's go. Back to the living room for the moment, shall we?" Greta's intentions were perfectly clear to Gregor. She meant to bring her mother safely and chase him from the wall. Well, let her try. He sat there in the picture and he would not give it up. He sooner leaped right in her face. But Gretty's words succeeded in unsettling her mother even more, taking one step to his side. She had a huge brown blotch on the flowered wallpaper, and before he was even able to realize that he saw it, there was Gregor. She cried out a hoarse, shrieking voice, "Oh God, oh God!" I fell back upon the settee, her arms spread wide as though she were giving up everything, and lay there without moving. "Gregor!" his sister shouted, raising her fist with a threatening glower. It was the first time she had addressed him directly in the Metamorphosis. He ran into the next room and fetched some sort of essence that would awaken her mother from her faint. Gregor wanted to help as well, but he had time enough to save the picture later. When he stuck fast to the glass and had to tear himself away by force, he too then ran into the next room, and he might offer his sister advice of some sort, like in the old days, when he only stand idly behind her as he rummaged among the various little bottles and scared her out of her wits, and she turned around. One bottle flew to the floor and shattered. A shard of glass scratched Gregor's face, and some sort of corrosive medicine engulfed him. Without further delay, Gretty took up as many bottles as she could hold and ran to them to her mother, slamming the door behind her foot. Gregor was now cut off from his mother, who was possibly on the brink of death, for which he himself was to blame. He could not open the door if he didn't want to drive away his sister, who had to stay there with his mother. There was nothing for him to do but wait. As tormented by his worries and self-reproach, he began to crawl about, crawling over everything, walls, furniture, the ceiling, and finally, in his despair, the entire room began to spin around him. He fell smack in the middle of the big table. A short while had passed. Gregor lay there, spent, and around him all was still, possibly a good sign. Then the bell rang. The maid was naturally locked up in her kitchen, and so Gretty had opened the door. Her father was back. What happened? His first words. The look in Gretty's face had no doubt revealed all. Gretty's voice as he responded was muffled. Apparently she was pressing her face against his chest. "Mother fainted, but she's better already. Gregor was broken out." "That's just what I expected," his father said. "I kept telling you, but you women refused to listen." To Gregor, it was just clear his father had misinterpreted Gretty's all too brief pronouncement. to assume him guilty of some act of violence. So it behooved Gregor to try to pacify his father, as he was lacking both the same means to enlighten them, in which in his mind he fled to the door of his room and impressed himself against it, so that the moment his father came to the living room from the vestibule, he would see that Gregor had every intention of returning at once to his room, that it was unnecessary to drive him back inside, and that one merely to open the door, and he could despair at once. But his father was in no mood to take notice of these. "Ah!" he exclaimed once upon entering, in a tone of voice suggesting he was once fierce and glad. Gregor pulled his head back in the door and turned it toward his father. He was truly not expected to see his father looking as he looked now, standing before him, though he was sure the novelty of crawling about and distracting him recently from paying as much attention as before the goings in the rest of the apartment. And really, he thought he had been prepared to find a change of set of circumstances. Even so, was this still his father? The same man who used to lie wearily entombed in his bed when Gregor set off on a business trip, who would greet him on the evening his return sitting in an armchair in a nightshirt, who, when incapable of rising, would merely raise his arms significantly in delight, and on the rare walks they had so shared a few Sundays each year and on the major holidays, would trudge between Gregor and his mother, who himself were already walking rather slowly, moving in a bit slower when they bundled up to the old overcoat, always in his gingerly advancing cane, and almost invariably coming to a halt, collecting his companions around him wherever he had something to say. Now he was standing properly erect, dressed in a smart blue uniform, his gold buttons and a sort worn out by porters in banking establishment. Above the jacket's tall, stiff collar was a powerful double chin unfurled. Beneath bushy eyebrows, his black eyes peered out acutely and attentively. His once disheveled white hair had been painstakingly combed and parted until it gleamed. He tossed his cap, to which a gold monogram was affixed, probably that of the bank, across the entire room in the wide arc of the land of the city, even advancing grim-faced upon Gregor with his tips of his long uniform jacket flung back in his hand in his trouser pockets. He himself probably had no idea what he intended to do. At any rate, he raised up each foot unusually high, and Gregor marveled at the gigantic dimensions of his boot soles. But he did not lose any time over them, having learned on the very first day of his new life that his father considered only the utmost severity appropriate for him, and so he fled from his father, hesitating whether his father stopped short, and then rushing forward again as soon as stirred. They circled around the room several times in this manner, without anything decisive occurring, and indeed, given the slow speed at which the interaction was taking place, without even having an appearance of chase. For this reason, Gregor remained at the floor level for the time being, especially as he heard his father might consider a particular wickedness on his part in taking refuge in the wall of ceiling. To be sure, he was forced to realize he would not be able to keep up even his pace for long, since each time his father took a step, he himself had to execute any number of motions. A shortness of breath began to set in. Even in his early life, his lungs had been none too reliable. He had now lurched along, revering all his strength in his continued flight, his eyes barely open, and not thinking in his stupefaction that there might be other ways of saving himself than rummaging across the floor. Indeed, he had almost forgotten he always had the walls at his disposal, though here he had sure they were obstructed by the delicately carved furniture of full, jagged, pointing edges. All at once, something flew out of the rug beside him, casually flung and rolled across his path. It was an apple, and already a second one came flying after it. In horror, Gregor stopped in his tracks. There was no point continuing to run now that his father decided to bombard him. He had filled his pockets with a fruit bowl in the sideboard, and now is topping apple after apple in Gregor's direction. For a moment, not even bothering to take particular aim, the petite red apples rolled around the floor as if electrified, knocking into each other. One lightly lobbed apple grazed Gregor's back and slid off again harmlessly, but it was immediately followed by another and bent himself in his back. Gregor tried to drag himself forward as if the sudden shocking pain might have vanished in the change of pace, but he felt nailed to the spot and collapsed there. His legs splayed out, all his senses in a state of bewilderment. He caught only a last glimpse of the door of his room flying open, his shrieking sister and his mother running out of the room before her wearing only chemise, for his sister, an undressed and unconscious woman, to let her breathe more freely, and he saw his mother rush to his father's side, and her unfastened skirts slipping one by one without her waist as she ran. Saw her stumble across his skirts as she flew herself with his father, embracing him in a perfect union with him. But now Gregor's vision began to fail him. He clasped her with her hands at the back of his father's head and pleaded with him to spare Gregor's life. And that's the end of that. Whoa! A lot has happened. Is that really a siren? All right. 1, 2, 3, and now we're back. So, yeah, that was chapter 2. And yes, while that was all happening, I so happened to make it like this. So it's supposed to say chapter 3 to end. Sorry. Here we go. So yeah, that's gonna be next episode where we read 33 pages. Today we read 31. And yeah. So I hope you guys have a super fantastic, wonderful day. People like being fish, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. That was a weird chapter. But yeah. Hope you guys have a super fantastic, wonderful day. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.